introducing more law when you already have laws that would capture most of all of the behaviour that has been alleged, I find quite difficult to see where we would see an obvious benefit here, because on the one hand, we already have laws that should capture this behaviour, but on the other hand, we know that there are significant problems with how we implement sexual offences law, so adding more is unlikely to improve the situation.
Do we need to reconsider the law around consent? In the Sunday Times, Alice, one of the women who's accused Russell Brand of sexual assault, makes the case. She says she met the comedian when she was 16 years old, that he would send a chauffeured car to pick her up from school, and he told her to save him in her phone under a fake name, referring to her as the child. She also says he sexually assaulted her. Russell Brand has denied all allegations of criminal behaviour. Well, writing in the Sunday Times today, Alice says her mum wasn't able to stop her dating Brand, but a law might have. She says it should be illegal for a person over the age of 21 to engage in sexual activity with someone under the age of 18. Dr. Hannah Bowes is Associate Professor in Criminal Law at Durham University's Law School. She's also Deputy Director of the Centre for Research into Violence and Abuse. Dr. Bowes, Hannah, good morning to you.
Good morning. Thanks for having me on.
It's really good to speak to you. It's such an important issue, and obviously it has grown in its sort of intensity today since Alice wrote this piece. I think I want to start, though, by asking why is the age of consent 16? What is that law designed to achieve or indeed protect against?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And there may well be arguments for why we want to have a different starting point for consent. But I think at the moment, the law is trying to strike a balance between protecting young people, so minors, from making decisions that actually they don't fully understand the consequences of, whilst also allowing for people to have the ability to make decisions about what they do with their body. And it is a very difficult fine line, I think, to get right, to balance where, people have that autonomy, but at the same time, we're protecting young people from making those decisions that can be potentially harmful.
And that's in recognition, frankly, of the fact that teenagers do have sex. And so that is considered kind of normal teenage behaviour that should not be criminalised.
Yeah, exactly. Again, there may be very good reasons for why we want to reconsider this. Particularly in light of the fact that you now have to be 18 to make almost all other adult-based decisions. But I think the one around sex is particularly difficult because it comes down to people's bodies. Whilst other things might be more around their economic productivity or their contributions to society, for example, keeping young people in education or saying that there are certain jobs that they can't do until a certain age. I think when it comes down to someone's kind of personal body, it's very difficult to find an age at which you get that correct balance of protecting, but also giving autonomy to people around what they do with their bodies.
Such an individual thing in so many ways. So then let's turn to what Alice is suggesting and just interrogate this a little. She has suggested staggered ages of consent, in which individuals between the ages of 16 and 18 could have relations with people within that same age bracket, but then going out with that would become a sort of criminal offence. What do you make of that in sort of practice? Could a staggered age of consent work?
Yeah, so, okay, I mean, I can completely understand the reasoning and the logic behind why you might introduce this. But I think I would have a few concerns around not only it being introduced, but also whether or not it would actually work in practice. I think, first of all, we have to be clear around what we expect the law to do. Often people think that adding new laws will solve problems. And MPs in particular are often very keen to do this because it's a relatively quick thing to do and can be seen to be having a sort of a positive, outcome or a positive effect on a particular social issue. However, in practice, more law rarely solves anything. We already have pretty good sexual offence laws. I'll caveat that in a moment, but in principle, on paper, our sexual offences are absolutely fine and they capture most of the behaviours and most of the contexts in which we would want them to. The problems we see, though, are that procedurally, those laws aren't always used particularly well. We know that conviction rates, prosecution and conviction for sexual offences are quite poor, and that is not because the law itself is necessarily an issue, but more around how it's applied and the sort of myths and stereotypes and things that feed into this. So, because of those reasons,
Mm.
actually introducing more law when you already have laws that would capture most of the, well, all of the behaviour that has been alleged, um, I find quite difficult to see where we would see an obvious benefit here. Because on the one hand, we already have laws that should capture this behaviour, but on the other hand, we know that there are significant problems with how we implement sexual offences law. So adding more is unlikely to improve the situation.
I understand. I suppose one of my thoughts on this is that laws like this have been established, but I suppose with other considerations, i.e., I'm thinking of an imbalance of power. So, for example, there are laws where adult teachers cannot have relations with teenage students, and that those actually remain in place even when the teenager is over 16, don't they? But that adds an extra dimension of exactly that imbalance of power consideration too.
Yeah, exactly. And I think they are for specific
Mm.
circumstances where you have that relationship, which is based on sort of trust and authority in a particular context. Um, and whereas what we're talking about here, or what's being suggested here, is much wider, and it would go beyond where there are any kind of pre-existing relationships within a, for example, an institutional setting, which is where we see the sexual offences that you're referring to
Mm.
there mainly apply. Um, I mean, there are other countries that have these sort of so-called Romeo and Juliet laws. I've actually been doing a little bit of research over the weekend just to see how they're used. I looked at a paper that has considered their use over a sort of 15-year period in the US. Most states have something akin to this. And actually, they found that they're just not being used. Less than a percent of all sexual offences related to this particular this sort of type of offending, the Romeo and Juliet offending. And I think that would be my concern here, that one, I think we have to be careful about just introducing new laws, because as I said, I don't think in general they do a lot, and we already have pretty thick statute books. So adding more,
Mm.
I think we have to be very careful about, there is a broader conversation to be had around whether or not we think that the age of 16 is getting things right in terms of people being able to have that autonomy, but also being protected. But then aside from that, if we did introduce them, I practically don't think that they would be very successful. One, because we don't have the success here anyway, and two, if you look at where they are being used elsewhere, actually there are indications that they're not being used well there either. So do we need to do more to make sure that young people are protected, particularly where we have people who are in their 20s, 30s, 40s and beyond initiating sexual relationships with them? Yes, absolutely we do. Is the law the right thing to do that? I don't think so.
That's really interesting. So I wonder if it comes down to society's attitudes, because to just broaden this slightly, I wonder if there are differences in fact, it's probably quite obvious in some ways that there are attitudes differences between men and women in terms of what is age appropriate and what might not be. It could be very contextual, i.e. if there's an age difference between, a 45-year-old and a 30-year-old, that's probably less frowned upon, for example. And I wonder if there's differences with same-sex relationships too. I mean, there are a lot of contexts to sort of broaden the discussion out into.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what I mean about the unintended consequences as well. You have to be quite careful, when you're creating new laws or starting these debates around age and relationships with other people, because it quickly is going to get quite complex, and there are going to be multiple different issues or factors that you would want to consider as part of this. I mean, one of the things that I would say is that when the behaviour that took place that Alice alleges was happening, we didn't have the offence of coercion and control. And that may well have picked up on quite a lot of the behaviour that's been spoken about in relation to what's alleged that Brand did. So it may be that actually sort of newer laws that have been introduced in the last few years would capture some of that behaviour as well. And the other thing to say is that our sentencing guidelines for most criminal offences do consider the age of the victim and potentially of the offender when deciding the appropriate sentence. So it can be what we call an aggravating factor if you have someone who's particularly young and or an offender who's particularly old, so a kind of a significant age gap may well be a feature of any kind of sentencing exercise. So it's not that we're totally incapable of reflecting this at the moment. And whether or not having another law would stop a relationship between two people, whether the police would actually practically have been able to stop a relationship, is a very different matter as well.
Yeah.
And ultimately, the behaviour we're talking about, those that would perpetrate that already know it's criminal. So really, would another law restating that it's criminal be likely to stop them when the existing law doesn't? I think that's probably not going to be the case. So we need to look at other ways of protecting young people. And back to your point just there, I mean, pornography. If you think about the kind of sexualization of the schoolgirl, you know, on the one hand, we would be introducing a law to protect against that, and then on the other, culturally, actually, you know, we kind of celebrate this idea of, as you said, potentially sort of men finding very young school uniform aged children to be kind of sexually attractive, and actually that is sort of really you know, kind of one of the mainstream features, I think, of pornography. So I do think there are bigger questions and considerations to be having here besides the law.